Now, we've had a year of Israel's genocidal onslaught against Gaza. Now, there has been, over the course of that year, Lebanon has been very much involved. We've seen up to this escalation, bombings, military onslaughts against Lebanon. Significant numbers of Lebanese people have already been killed over the last year, but clearly we've had a catastrophic escalation in terms of an invasion in Lebanon, which many media outlets refuse to call it, as well as an attack on Beirut. Now, I'm really delighted to be joined by Karim Makdisi, who is the Associate Professor of International Politics at the American University of Beirut, and he's the co-host of, I have to say, a podcast many people talk about. It's become a must listen to so many people, Makdisi Streets, which he is the co-host of. Karim, firstly, thanks so much for joining us at such a difficult time. Also, you put with our technical difficulties, but we finally see you, which is great. But you're in Paris at the moment. Just to clarify, I just want to ask you firstly. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. There's a huge amount of emotional labour here involved, isn't there? I'm asking you to talk about something, world events, horrors, but this is your city, this is your country. Can you just tell us at the moment what's it like having to talk, just what's going through you, and kind of how that reflects what's happening through the minds of so many Lebanese people right now?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it's an extraordinarily difficult moment. The humanitarian situation, just to start with the humanitarian situation, as you know, there's over 1 million people that have been displaced. A lot of them are in Beirut. A large chunk of them, of these displaced, are in Beirut and in the neighborhood where, personally, where I live and where my family lives and, where the university is. There's a lot of people there. The government, as you know, probably since 2019 collapsed. The state basically collapsed at the time. It's in a bankrupt. There's really nothing going on. So most of the time, it's personal, community initiatives of people trying to deal with some of the displaced, trying to host them, trying to put them in flats, trying to feed them, blankets, all this kind of thing. And it's an extremely, extremely difficult moment, dispiriting moment, particularly since, as we see every day and especially every night, these massive attacks that are increasing, in fact, in Beirut, and increasingly into not just what's called the Dahi, the suburbs of Beirut, but also now increasingly into more central Beirut. And we see more and more civilian destruction, more and more civilian targets being deliberately hit. And it doesn't really matter what the mainstream media is saying; they're very much deliberately being hit. It's an incredible form of terrorism at every level, and it has been that for a long time. In fact, it's been like that my entire life. I mean, I grew up in the civil war in Lebanon, but also went through the Israeli invasions, and especially in 1982, and then the massive invasion in 2006. So in this sense, many of us have been through these kinds of invasions before, but this is by all means the biggest, the worst, and the cruelest in some ways. 2006 was very, very bad. But this is even crueler, and it doesn't look like there's any way that it's going to stop anytime soon. So people are very dispirited. There's, on the other hand, if one wants to find positive things, there's a lot of solidarity. Unlike what the Israelis like, unlike what the Israelis want, rather than mass kind of sectarian and kind of communal and social fighting, there's actually a lot more solidarity in all the areas, and a lot more, as I said, kind of community support. There's a lot of understanding. And I would even say that even those that are, and there are a considerable number of kind of political, let's say, opponents, or those that don't like Hezbollah as a political party, or what it did in Syria, or what's done in Lebanon, even those people in general at the humanitarian level, at the human level, have been very sympathetic and have been doing what they can, what each person trying to do what they can do to support these people. So having said that, it's an incredibly difficult moment, and the kinds of attacks that are happening in Beirut, but not just Beirut. Beirut is in the news, of course, but you have Sidon, you have Sur, Tyre, you have Baalbek, you have all the villages and towns across the south. And if you see a map, it's just of the there's a lot of people doing these nice graphics. If you see these maps of evacuation orders, so now what the Israelis are doing, like they did in Gaza, is they send every single day, they send these little maps that say, okay, in neighborhood 1, 2, 3, this is true of Beirut, but it's also true in the south, neighborhoods 1, 2, 3, 4, evacuate now. and then sometimes they'll hit within half an hour or something. And we're talking about things they release on Twitter and social media in English, So and then of course they hit. So they're clearing out vast chunks of the south, large chunks now increasingly of Beirut itself. And as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's not clear where we're going in this.
I mean, you mentioned an area of Beirut called Dahi, and you've talked about the 2006 invasion. The reason I bring that up is some may have heard of Dahi doctrine, developed in the 2006 Israeli war in Lebanon, which involves attacking civilian infrastructure in order to try and to get them to turn against Hezbollah, and using violence for political ends against civilians, terrorism, which is what other people describe it. I mean, do you think the Dahi doctrine is in play? Is that what we're seeing here, witnessing?
Yes. Yes, the Dahi doctrine is something that kind of comes in a lot. And as you said, basically it gives the Israelis this is their doctrine. So they get to basically hit any civilian area or target where they will claim there's some kind of military target. So they can destroy, in this case, as happened in 2006, they destroyed the entirety of the Dahi, these suburbs, where, just remind viewers and listeners that Dahi is not some, place, some kind of industrial area where nobody lives. It's one of the most densely populated civilian areas. So while there are Hezbollah offices and there are the media and there's various things, it's an extremely densely populated area with hundreds of thousands of people live, from lower class to middle class, and it's not it's quite a diverse place as well. So that's important to kind of note that. But the point of this is that, yes, they give themselves this idea of the Dahi doctrine. They get to destroy. So when they say, well, we're killing this commander, or we're killing this person, that person, this security person, the other person, they're taking down buildings. They're taking down not just one building, but several buildings at a time. When they assassinated the Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Nasrallah, they hit over 80 tons of bunker-busting missiles. They took out an entire neighborhood and incinerated a lot of people along the way. So this is the kind of thing that they're doing. But I would just point out one other thing. So my critique, in a sense, of all those who talk about the Dahi doctrine, it's somehow as though this is not Israeli policy since 1948. They've always been like that. I mean, Israel was created at a genocide, the Nakba, in 1948, 47, 48. And that continues all the way till now, to the Gaza genocide, to the 2006 war in the Dahi, and the South Lebanon, to this war where they're hitting not just the Dahi, not just the south, but as I said, in the Bekaa, in the Baalbek, in the north, just about all parts of Lebanon. So they give themselves the right to attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, and then come up with flimsy excuses about who's there and what kind of military structure is there. I'll give you one example if you want, which is just last night. There was an absolute massive bombardment in which several buildings in central Beirut were hit. And then immediately the Israelis, as they do, claimed that there was a major Hezbollah figure, Hisham Safi-Eddin, who's some would say might be taking over from Sayyid Nasrallah, although that's not, they haven't declared anybody yet, but that's what the Israelis say. And then when it was clear that he wasn't there, they immediately, oh no, there was a security meeting, and so therefore it's okay, that's all right. We get to kill all these people anyway because we just decided that there's a big security meeting, so that's okay. So we get to hit civilians, but as I said, my own personal entire life, the Israelis have been hitting civilian targets. They did so in the Israeli invasion in 1982, the siege of Beirut. They've done so in all their wars and all their incursions and all their attacks, to say nothing of Palestine, to say nothing of the West Bank and Gaza and other areas.
I mean, you mentioned there the question of, I guess, sectarianism, and that's how it's kind of, and we've seen a lot of that in the coverage. And obviously the Israeli state itself, its official mantra is, I was not with Lebanon. It's specifically with Hezbollah. And those are two separate questions. But I mean, what's your thought just in terms of how things are being portrayed? It's about, firstly, the sectarian divisions. So, much of Lebanon is, the idea is they would be sympathetic. But that also the Israeli mantra that we're focused here on our quarrel is with Hezbollah, not with the Lebanese people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question that really is, it's actually very, very complex. But, if I could say a couple of things, it would be, in its own kind of logic, Israel is a apartheid state. It's a textbook apartheid state. So even in their attacking, even in their military logic, they use apartheid. So they're attacking what they claim is Hezbollah, but actually we're talking about the entire Shia areas. So in South Lebanon, in the Bekaa, Baalbek, and in the so-called Dahi, where they keep saying it's a Hezbollah stronghold. But as I said, it's a dense civilian population. So their idea is very clear, which is to destroy as much as possible of the entire Shia community, civilian infrastructure, create what is now 1 million displaced, mostly Shia from South Lebanon, from the Bekaa, from other areas, from the Dahi, into different parts of Beirut, and create sort of some kind of sectarian troubles as all these people kind of go into other areas. Destitute, no money, had to leave their houses very, very quickly. As I said, in some cases, in a matter of minutes, they just had to pick up and rush out before their buildings get taken down or they get destroyed. So their idea is but they've been doing this again ever since I can remember. They did this. This was explicit in for example, in the early 90s, in 1993 and 1996, when the resistance was operating in South Lebanon and quite effectively against Israeli occupation. Remember, Israel was occupying Lebanon from 1982 until the year 2000. So, and Hezbollah and other resistance groups were fighting them in occupied Lebanese territory. And as they were gaining and becoming more effective in the 1990s, Hezbollah, the Israelis would kind of increase their attacks. And there were two major incursions in the early 90s, 93 and then 1996. And very destructive. Of course, they killed, they wounded, etc., and they hit infrastructure. But one of the things they kept saying was, we want to kind of create this displacement and then create sectarian tensions, which in turn will put huge pressure on Hezbollah, which in turn will kind of, just make them much less effective and force them to kind of stand down. So they're doing this now, but on steroids. They're doing this now on steroids, and the idea is they can claim, well, we're just hitting Hezbollah. But effectively it means we're killing every single Shia and anybody that is living in Shia, supposedly Shia majority kind of areas. But even that is going to keep on increasing beyond that. So that's clear. We know the pattern from Gaza. We know the pattern from other Lebanese wars. They will go after every civilian. They'll terrorize every single neighborhood, and they'll keep on expanding.
I mean, we know, the Israeli invasion, obviously from 1982 onwards, those are the conditions which Hezbollah emerged. What do you think the Israeli strategy is this time? I mean, you've had Israeli politicians openly discuss a de facto, well, they talk about a border zone. What they mean there is the ethnic cleansing, the violent removal of the people living there. I mean, do you think, it seems almost unlikely that they would want to repeat what happened last time, which suggests something far more, well, sinister is the wrong word. I mean, what do you think they're planning based on their behavior as of yet?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think there's a couple of things. First, I think a context. The Israelis, for over 100 years, before there was an Israeli state, the Zionist delegation in after World War I came and tried to get the British to push the French so that the border between Palestine at the time and Lebanon would be at the Litani River. So they knew they wanted the economic and the water resources that are quite plentiful in South Lebanon. And so since then, they've been trying to either annex, occupy, more recently demilitarize, and so there's a long history of this. So so there's that. The other part is to try to create a control over South Lebanon in a way that they tried in 1982, for example, and they failed in 2006. So in 1982, what they were able to impose was a president. They forced a presidential election that happened at the time with Bashir Jumayyan, where they forced the parliament to meet under occupation to elect the president, who was, before he even became, while he was still president-elect, was then assassinated. And then there was a treaty that was signed by the next president in 1983, which is a kind of infamous treaty. That was basically a treaty of surrender, which basically would give the Israelis what they wanted in South Lebanon and install let's say, if you want to be generous, a friendly government in Lebanon. And you can think about the model of the Palestinian Authority. So the idea now, in 2006, they wanted to do the same thing, but it failed because Hezbollah was quite effective in their fighting, much more so than the Israelis and the Americans who were pushing the Israelis at the time with George W. Bush. And they wanted to kind of pacify Lebanon, pacify Hezbollah, just after the Iraq War, on their way to Syria and then ultimately to Iran. And by the way, this is continuing now. And so Hezbollah defeated them in South Lebanon. So that whole plan to go from Iraq all the way to Iran via Lebanon and Syria failed in South Lebanon, and because of Hezbollah in 2006. So now this plan has kind of been revived. What I see is that Netanyahu and the Israelis have become now kind of, let's say, drunk on their own power and their own kind of tactical successes from this pager to what they love to describe as kind of James Bondian kind of things, but really macabre, kind of, evil, maiming tactics and basically pure terrorism, and hitting and the assassinations, this kind of thing. A lot of tactical successes, especially the assassinations that even Hezbollah kind of concedes are tactical successes. But the idea that Netanyahu, I think, now has is to not only try to demilitarize South Lebanon, that's been their long goal, and that's embodied, what they say is embodied in the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 that was convened after the 2006 war, but to try to do this by force. So to disarm Hezbollah, to defeat it, because you can't disarm them without totally defeating them. So to disarm and create a demilitarized zone. What I think that won't even be enough at this point. I think if Hezbollah is defeated, they'll not only disarm anybody that's in that area, they will, I think, occupy at least the 5-10 kilometers into South Lebanon. You hear all these crazy settlers that are now trying to kind of talk about resettling, or as they say, resettling South Lebanon. It's promised to them as part of Greater Israel. And while these are fringe people and really cuckoo people, the way the Israeli state works, you need to take them seriously at this point. So I think they've always had their eye on South Lebanon. I think anybody that knows the way the Israelis work will understand that they do not understand treaties or just stopping. They keep on going, they keep going, and they keep going. So if Hezbollah loses, then South Lebanon is lost. And I think that's the idea, one way or the other, whether it's occupation or demilitarization. And the idea that the Americans have had since 2006, and the Brits, by the way, the UK is very much part of this, is to kind of turn the Lebanese army into sort of like the Palestinian Authority, turn the Lebanese army into a local kind of anti-terrorist unit that would be opposed to Hezbollah or any other kind of forces that might go against the kind of British-American-Israeli plan. They've not been able to do this. The Lebanese army remains where it is and remains quite ineffective, symbolically important, but ineffective militarily.
Just one final question. I mean, you've talked about the triumphalism of the Israeli state after, the pager terrorist attacks, and I'm actually using the language there of the former head of the CIA, but also, the assassination. Well, I say the assassination of the Secretary General of Hezbollah, but we also mean the mass slaughter of countless Lebanese civilians, which accompanied it, of course. But the role of the United States is crucial for the underpinning of
absolutely
Israeli triumphalism. I just want your thoughts on that in terms of, we've had occasionally, you get hand-wringing from the US, and this isn't to let them off the hook, by the way. What I'm going to say, if anything makes it worse, it's not actually in their interest for this escalation a lot of the time, but they carry on providing the arms, the weapons, the aid that Israel needs to continue. So I just want your final thoughts really on the role of the US government and administration as it hand-wrings and continues to arm Israel in its onslaughts.
Yeah. Full partnership. So I think for the first several months when the Israelis with American support were pulverizing Gaza, committing genocide in Gaza, with total full American support and weapons, without which, and it's just so important to keep reminding ourselves, without these American weapons and Germans at the beginning, the Israelis would not be able to do anything. So this is not this Israeli bravado. This is all American weapons, all American support. If America today stops, Israelis will have to stop almost instantaneously, because they simply won't have the weapons or the ammunition to kind of continue, let alone the diplomatic support. So they're in full support. What happened, I think, for the first several months while the Gaza genocide was taking place, I do think that the Americans were putting a certain kinds of restraint on Netanyahu, telling him, go ahead, kill as many people, Palestinians, as you want in Gaza especially, but you cannot expand beyond a certain amount in South Lebanon, and you certainly can't extend regionally to Iran. That's, we don't want that. When Netanyahu went, I think in July, to the United States, and this kind of, remember the obscene standing ovation at Congress. He came back. As soon as he came back from that trip, and by the way, it wasn't just the politicians in the Congress, etc. It was also all the big social media people, the corporate media. It wasn't just politicians. That's very important. Since you work in the media, you know much better than me. But there was very clear meetings that took place in order, at the time, up until that July moment. That's when Israel was being portrayed. It was very clear that their image on social media, etc., across the world, the global public opinion, the protests on U.S. and U.K. and other kind of campuses, the South African case at the ICJ, the International Criminal Court, all of that stuff was putting huge pressure on the Israelis. Suddenly, when you came back, the pager stuff begins, the assassinations begin, the massive kind of switch in media portrayal really also starts to kind of be pushed. What Elon Musk on Twitter, all these kinds of things. The Americans then see, okay, what they wanted to do before that was to come up with a deal. So before July, the American plan was to come to a deal with Lebanon that would de-link Lebanon from Gaza. Remember that Hezbollah and Nasrallah's one and only objective from October 8th, when they started, until now has been, we will have an immediate ceasefire as soon as there's a Gaza ceasefire. But we need to link these two things together. The American plan through Amos Hochstein, Biden's mediator, who, by the way, is an Israeli, who served in the IDF, or IOF, as we like to say. So their plan was to de-link. That didn't happen because Nasrallah and Hezbollah refused to de-link from Gaza and the Gaza genocide. Once the tactical successes of the Israelis and Netanyahu kind of proceeded, the Americans changed their tune. Biden changed his tune. They withdrew this kind of diplomatic deals. And they are in full support, no matter what they're leaking in the media, no matter what they're saying. It's very clear. And today, I think there was a report that came out and kind of basically confirmed this, that the Americans from the highest level, from Biden onwards, are saying we are in support of an Israeli invasion to try to end Hezbollah as at least to end it as a fighting force that's a serious fighting force that can threaten anybody, and that way it also weakens Iran, of course. So the big target is Iran. As far as the Israelis are concerned, as far as the Americans are concerned, Lebanon, Hezbollah is just one big Iranian proxy. So if Arabs die, if Lebanese die, Palestinians die, it doesn't matter. They're not really humans. They're all basically Iranian proxies. And all of this is okay because Iran has just put everybody there, and it's okay to kill everybody. This is, of course, incredibly wrong and incredibly difficult to accept, and I don't think will work. I think if you see what's going on the ground, as soon as the Israelis started their invasion, it's not an incursion, it's an invasion. As soon as they started their invasion 2-3 days ago, they've been handed several defeats by Hezbollah fighters. More than a dozen soldiers were killed, at least in one fight. A series of Merkava tanks were destroyed, and the Israelis have had to withdraw each time with their tails between their legs. In return, so they've been unable to do anything so far, anyway. On the ground. And so in return, what they've been doing is increasing their attacks on, as we started this, in Beirut and other, in Tyre, in Baalbek and other areas, to kill and destroy as much of the civilian infrastructure and civilians as possible, to create as much terror among the Lebanese population, to create as much, to kind of push the displaced into smaller and smaller areas like they're doing in Gaza, so that they can sort of, hit them. They're literally putting zones, and they're pushing people from one zone to the other zone to another zone, then another zone. And each day these zones are going to increase. The Hezbollah fighters on the ground in South Lebanon are incredibly, incredibly well prepared. No matter what happens to their leadership, no matter how many are assassinated, these guys have their plans. They have they've got their strategy, they've got their tactics, and they will not give up. That is 100% for sure. So they're either all going to be killed, or, and this is what I think part of the Israeli strategy is going to be, which is just try to come in from kind of towards Syria, surround South Lebanon, turn it into a kind of a war zone, just absolutely destroy South Lebanon, while the kind of Beirut and other areas are isolated in a different kind of battle. I think that's probably what they're trying to do. I just think that they don't have you see that in Gaza, after 1 year, they're still unable to kill Sinwar. They're still unable to achieve any of their military objectives. They're still fighting Hamas in Gaza. And so why people would expect them to destroy Hezbollah in a matter of a few days or a couple of weeks, it's beyond me. So this is a very long battle. We're still in the first few days of it, the first week of it, and I think it's going to be very bloody, very dangerous, and it doesn't look like the United States is going to stop them. And I don't know what's going on with the Europeans. They seem to have totally disappeared. even at the humanitarian front. I might add, Owen, one thing: the NGOs have disappeared. I don't see many the international NGOs that, if you remember in 2020, in August 2020, when there was a massive explosion in Beirut port, and it was very traumatic. It was an unbelievable explosion, a couple of hundred people killed, many wounded. The whole neighborhood was destroyed. The amount of money that came in from the West, from Europe, from France, from all these countries was unbelievable. The reconstruction that happened was unbelievable. And welcome, of course, it was fantastic. Now, when you see these displaced, 1 million people displaced, because of who they are and because of where they're coming from, suddenly we see that all these international NGOs, of course, there's always good people working, but sort of the heavy presence, the big money, we don't see them very much. So we're back to neighborhoods, communities, individuals, people organizing themselves, people trying to do as much as possible to alleviate the suffering, because they know this is there's a long October, November at least ahead of us, and people are scared.
Very sobering, shocking stuff, infuriating stuff, but so much insight. All of us, I know in terms of the audience, we're always so lucky to have incredible guests, but I know there's a huge amount, as I said at the beginning, of emotional labor. It's not easy to talk about horrors and atrocities being committed against your own country as we speak on such a scale. So I do really, really appreciate it. And I know everyone watching and listening will really, really appreciate it. We need your voices more than ever. The voice of people like yourself, people who actually have lived experience and can speak in a way much of the Western media has decided to erase the voices that we need to be hearing from at the moment. So for those watching, please share this video. Make sure Karim's voice is heard loud and clear. Leave your thoughts, your comments. That helps the algorithm so more people will watch and engage. Subscribe. But Karim, honestly, it's such an honor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Owen.